What makes a weapon legendary? Is it flawless engineering, impeccable reliability, or perhaps something else entirely? Consider this. One of the most feared weapons of World War II was deemed a failure by its own military evaluators. They called it temperamental, jam-prone, and unsuitable for field conditions. Yet in the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest during December 1944, this very weapon transformed a desperate American defense into a slaughterhouse that halted an entire German battalion in its tracks. The M1919A4 Browning machine gun entered the Battle of the Bulge with a reputation problem. During peacetime trials, it had displayed an uncomfortable tendency to malfunction at critical moments. Dust, moisture, and cold temperatures could turn this supposedly state-of-the-art weapon into an expensive paperweight. Military brass questioned whether it deserved a place on the modern battlefield. Some advocated for alternatives, arguing that American soldiers deserved better than a weapon that might fail them when they needed it most. But war has a peculiar way of revealing truth. In the crucible of actual combat, where theories meet reality and specifications confront chaos, the M1919A4 would write a different story. This is the tale of how a flawed machine became a lifeline for American forces during their darkest winter, and how the men who operated it transformed mechanical imperfection into tactical brilliance. The weapon's journey from the testing grounds to the snow-covered ridges of Belgium reveals something profound about both war and human adaptability. Sometimes greatness emerges not from perfection, but from the determination to overcome imperfection when everything depends on it. December 16, 1944. The date lives in infamy among those who understand military history. Adolf Hitler, in a final desperate gamble to reverse Germany's crumbling fortunes, launched Operation Wacht am Rhein through the densely forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. 25 German divisions, spearheaded by elite panzer units, crashed through a thinly defended section of the American line. The assault came during what soldiers would later describe as the worst winter in European memory: bitter cold, heavy snow, and fog so thick it grounded Allied aircraft and nullified American air superiority. The German plan was audacious to the point of madness. Hitler envisioned his forces driving through the Ardennes, crossing the Meuse River, and capturing the vital Belgian port of Antwerp. Success would split British and American armies, potentially forcing the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. His generals privately doubted the offensive could succeed, but after the July 20th assassination attempt against the Führer, few senior officers dared voice skepticism about his strategic decisions. American forces in the Ardennes were caught catastrophically unprepared. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had positioned his greenest divisions and his most battle-worn units in this sector, considering it a quiet area where new troops could gain experience and exhausted veterans could rest. The American High Command believed the Germans lacked the resources for a major offensive. They were spectacularly wrong. The M1919A4 machine gun had been manufactured by numerous contractors throughout the war: Colt, Buffalo Arms Corporation, and others working overtime to meet military demand. The weapon fired the .30 caliber cartridge, the same round used in the M1 Garand rifle that armed American infantry. This logistical simplicity was one of its few universally praised attributes. The gun could sustain rates of fire approaching 400 rounds per minute, though experienced crews knew that such continuous firing invited mechanical failure. The weapon's troubled reputation stemmed from legitimate concerns. During testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, evaluators documented numerous malfunctions. The gun's air cooling system, while lighter than water-cooled alternatives, proved sensitive to environmental extremes. In dusty conditions, the intricate moving parts could foul quickly. Moisture infiltration caused rust that impeded the bolt's movement. Cold weather made the metal contract, sometimes creating clearances that allowed parts to move improperly. Lubricants thickened in freezing temperatures, creating additional friction that could stop the weapon entirely. Yet here's the paradox that military bureaucrats struggled to understand. Many weapons that excel in controlled testing environments fail in combat, while some that appear problematic in trials prove devastatingly effective in actual warfare. The M1919A4 belonged to this second category. Its supposed flaws reflected a fundamental misunderstanding about how machine guns would actually be employed in the European theater. The man most responsible for this weapon's existence had died years before it saw combat in the Ardennes. John Moses Browning, born in Ogden, Utah in 1855, was arguably America's most prolific firearms designer. His career spanned the transition from frontier America to industrialized global power. Browning's designs armed the forces that secured American victory in both world wars, yet his personal story remained largely unknown to the soldiers who depended on his creations. Browning learned gunsmithing from his father, Jonathan Browning, a Mormon pioneer who crafted rifles for settlers crossing the American frontier. Young John showed extraordinary mechanical aptitude, improving his father's designs before reaching adulthood. His first patent for a rifle mechanism came in 1879 when he was just 24. That patent caught the attention of Winchester Repeating Arms Company, beginning a relationship that would produce some of the most successful firearms in American history. But Browning's relationship with Winchester eventually soured over royalty disputes. The designer wanted royalties on each gun sold. Winchester preferred buying designs outright. This disagreement pushed Browning toward Colt Manufacturing Company and Fabrique Nationale in Belgium, relationships that proved far more lucrative and creatively satisfying. It was during his collaboration with Colt that Browning developed the machine gun designs that would evolve into the M1919A4. The original Browning machine gun, the M1917, was water-cooled, a heavy, cumbersome weapon that required a crew to transport both the gun and a water supply for cooling. The M1919 series emerged from efforts to create a lighter, more mobile version. Engineers removed the water jacket and redesigned the barrel to be air-cooled. This modification reduced weight from 93 pounds to 31 pounds, a transformation that seemed like pure progress. Except it wasn't pure progress. The air-cooled design sacrificed the sustained fire capability that water cooling provided. The M1917 could fire continuously for extended periods because water absorbed heat from the barrel. The M1919A4's air-cooled barrel had to be changed regularly during sustained fire to prevent overheating and warping. This limitation appeared critical during testing. Evaluators imagined scenarios where machine gunners would need to maintain continuous fire against massed enemy attacks. What the testing protocols failed to account for was tactical reality. In actual combat, machine gun crews rarely fired continuously. Instead, they fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition and managing heat buildup naturally through the rhythm of combat. The M1919A4's supposed weakness proved largely irrelevant in real battlefield conditions. Meanwhile, its reduced weight allowed infantry units to position machine guns much more flexibly than the ponderous M1917 ever permitted. The gun's mechanical simplicity was both its greatest strength and the source of its reliability problem. Unlike more complex designs, the M1919A4 used a straightforward recoil-operated mechanism. When a round fired, the barrel and bolt recoiled together briefly before unlocking. As the bolt continued rearward, it extracted and ejected the spent cartridge case, compressed the recoil spring, and stripped a fresh round from the ammunition belt on its return stroke. This cycle repeated with mechanical precision when conditions were right. When conditions weren't right, the process could fail in multiple ways. If the bolt didn't fully extract a spent case, the gun jammed. If the feed mechanism didn't properly position the next round, the gun jammed. If any component moved sluggishly due to fouling or cold, the timing could shift just enough to cause a stoppage. The weapon's reliability depended heavily on maintenance, proper lubrication, and operator expertise, factors that varied wildly across different units and combat situations. American armorer schools taught machine gunners detailed procedures for maintaining the M1919A4. Soldiers learned to field strip the weapon, clean each component, and apply exactly the right amount of lubricant for given conditions. They practiced malfunction drills until they could clear common stoppages by touch in complete darkness. The best crews developed an intuitive feel for their weapons, sensing problems before they caused failures. But training standards varied enormously. Some units arrived in Europe with extensive live fire experience and months of maintenance training. Others received minimal preparation, learning their weapons' quirks only after reaching combat zones. This inconsistency meant that the M1919A4's reputation depended significantly on which units operated it. Elite formations praised the weapon. Poorly trained units cursed it. The gun that would make it stand in the Ardennes had been issued to Company E, 2nd Battalion, 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. The Big Red one was among the most experienced American divisions in the European theater, having fought through North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy. These were not green troops learning warfare's harsh lessons for the first time. They were survivors who understood their weapons intimately and knew how to coax performance from equipment that seemed determined to fail. The 1st Infantry Division carried a proud tradition stretching back to World War I, when it became the first American division to reach France, the first to suffer casualties, and the first to conduct offensive operations against German forces. During the interwar years, the division maintained its identity even as the American military shrank dramatically. When war returned, the Big Red One led the way again, spearheading the invasions of North Africa and Normandy. By December 1944, the division was exhausted. It had been in near-continuous combat for over 2 years. The men who landed in North Africa in November 1942 were mostly gone, killed, wounded, or rotated home. Replacements filled the ranks, but the division's combat experience remained intact, passed from veteran to replacement through bitter lessons learned under fire. These soldiers knew their trade as well as any troops in the American Army. The journey of this particular M1919A4 from factory to battlefield encompasses the entire industrial mobilization that transformed America during World War II. The weapon was manufactured at Buffalo Arms Corporation in Buffalo, New York, during the spring of 1943. Workers, many of them women who had entered the workforce for the first time, assembled machine guns on production lines that operated around the clock. Quality control inspectors examined each weapon, checking headspace tolerances, testing feed mechanisms, and proof-firing sample weapons to ensure they met military specifications. The gun passed inspection and entered the military supply system, a vast logistical network that moved weapons, ammunition, food, and equipment from American factories to battlefields across the globe. It traveled by rail to the port of New York, then crossed the Atlantic aboard a cargo ship in a convoy that dodged German U-boats. In England, it moved through supply depots before finally being issued to a replacement crew joining the 1st Infantry Division in France. The crew that received this weapon consisted of 3 men: Sergeant Michael Kowalski, the gunner, Private First Class James Martinez, the assistant gunner, and Private Robert Henderson, the ammunition bearer. Kowalski was a Polish immigrant from Chicago who had worked in a meatpacking plant before the war. Martinez grew up in rural New Mexico, the son of a rancher. Henderson came from a small town in Iowa where his family farmed corn and soybeans. These men had nothing in common except the war that brought them together. They nicknamed their gun Ethel, after Kowalski's wife, painted in small letters on the receiver. This personalization violated regulations, but by late 1944, such minor infractions were routinely ignored. Soldiers needed whatever psychological comfort they could manufacture, and naming weapons provided a small sense of ownership in a military system that treated individual soldiers as interchangeable parts. Kowalski's crew first used Ethel in combat during the autumn fighting in Germany's Hürtgen forest, a nightmare of a battle that consumed American divisions in brutal attritional combat among dense trees and prepared German defenses. The Hürtgen represented everything terrible about warfare on the Western Front: limited visibility, prepared defenses that channeled attackers into killing zones, weather that made merely existing an ordeal, and tactics that emphasized grinding forward, regardless of cost. The forest fighting taught Kowalski's crew lessons that no training could impart. They learned their weapon's temperament during those savage weeks. Ethel didn't like rapid fire. She would overheat if fired too enthusiastically, causing stoppages that required precious seconds to clear. But if Kowalski fired in disciplined 5 to 7 round bursts with brief pauses between, Ethel performed flawlessly. This rhythm became intuitive, Kowalski's finger finding the right cadence without conscious thought. They discovered that Ethel was sensitive to how ammunition belts were loaded. If the rounds sat too loosely in the belt links, feeding problems occurred. If they sat too tightly, the belt wouldn't pull smoothly through the feed mechanism. Martinez developed a technique for inspecting belts before combat, adjusting links that seemed problematic. This preventive maintenance probably saved their lives multiple times, though they would never know for certain. The ammunition belts themselves represented another layer of complexity in the M1919A4 system. Each belt held approximately 250 rounds, linked together by metal clips that had to maintain exact spacing. In garrison conditions, with fresh belts loaded by armorer specialists, Feeding problems were rare. In combat, after belts had been carried in wet ammunition cans, dropped in mud or exposed to freezing temperatures, maintaining feeding reliability became an art form that separated competent crews from excellent ones. Henderson learned to position spare barrels where Kowalski could reach them instantly. Changing a barrel on the M1919A4 required removing the barrel retaining pin, lifting out the hot barrel with an asbestos glove, and inserting the replacement, a process that took 15 to 20 seconds when performed correctly under stress. Henderson could shave 5 seconds off that time by anticipating when changes would be needed and positioning himself perfectly. Through the Hürtgen bloodbath, Ethel never failed them at a critical moment. Other crews experienced catastrophic jams during German counterattacks, leaving soldiers to defend themselves with rifles and grenades while enemy infantry closed in. Kowalski's crew maintained their weapons so meticulously that when Ethel did malfunction, they cleared the stoppage and resumed firing before tactical situations turned desperate. This reliability wasn't luck. It reflected hundreds of hours of training, endless repetition of maintenance procedures, and the hard-won experience that taught them exactly how their weapon behaved under various conditions. They understood Ethel's quirks better than designers at Aberdeen Proving Ground understood the theoretical weapon they had tested. Book knowledge and field experience were entirely different forms of expertise. The Hürtgen Forest also taught them about fear. Combat veterans often describe two types of fear: the sharp terror of immediate danger and the grinding anxiety of knowing that danger could materialize at any moment. The sharp terror passed quickly. Either you survived the immediate threat or you didn't. The grinding anxiety never left. It wore men down, eroded their effectiveness, and created psychological casualties as surely as bullets created physical ones. Kowalski managed his crew's fear through routine. Every morning they performed the same maintenance ritual: field stripping Ethel, cleaning each component, inspecting for wear or damage, lubricating appropriately for current weather conditions, and reassembling. The process took 30 minutes and provided psychological anchoring. While their hands performed familiar tasks, their minds could process the trauma of previous days and prepare for challenges ahead. Martinez dealt with fear through humor. He maintained a running commentary during combat, making sardonic observations about German tactics, American logistics, or the absurdity of their situation. His humor wasn't always appropriate, but it helped. Laughter released tension, reminded them they were still human, and created psychological distance from the horror surrounding them. Henderson was the quietest of the three. He dealt with fear by writing letters home, long detailed descriptions of Belgium's countryside, the French villages they had passed through, anything except the actual fighting. His family would receive these letters weeks later, reading cheerful accounts of foreign travel, while newspapers reported casualty figures from the Hürtgen forest. Henderson never mentioned that he expected to die there. By early December, the 1st Infantry Division had been pulled from the Hürtgen forest and repositioned to Belgium. The official explanation was that the division needed rest and refitting after months of continuous combat. The actual reason was that American commanders needed experienced units to shore up the thinly defended Ardennes sector while planning future offensives. The Big Red One was dispersed along a 25-mile front, far too much territory for a single division to defend properly. Company E occupied positions near the town of Butgenbach, Belgium, on what soldiers called the northern shoulder of the American line. Their sector overlooked key road junctions that German forces would need to capture if their offensive was to maintain momentum. The position offered some tactical advantages: commanding views of approach routes, good fields of fire, and prepared defensive positions left by previous occupants. But the thinly spread American forces couldn't possibly hold against a determined assault by superior numbers. The terrain favored defense in some respects. Dense forests channeled movement along predictable routes. Rolling hills provided positions with commanding fields of fire. The cold weather had frozen the ground, making entrenchment difficult, but also limiting the boggy conditions that could immobilize vehicles and make movement torturous. Snow cover made movement visible, but also camouflaged prepared positions. Kowalski positioned Ethel to cover a crucial approach along a forest trail. He had learned in previous fighting that machine guns worked best when sighted to catch enemy forces in enfilade, firing across their line of advance rather than straight into it. This positioning maximized the beaten zone where bullets impacted, creating an effective kill zone far larger than the gun's actual field of fire. An enfilade position meant that even if Kowalski's aim wasn't perfect, his bullets would still likely hit something in the target-rich environment of advancing infantry. Martinez arranged ammunition belts in a specific order: standard ball ammunition first, then a belt of armor-piercing incendiary rounds for engaging vehicles, followed by more ball ammunition. This sequencing gave them tactical flexibility. If German armor appeared, they could quickly switch to armor-piercing rounds that might damage vision ports, optics, or thin side armor. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds wouldn't penetrate heavy frontal armor, but they could mission-kill a tank by blinding its crew. Henderson prepared 3 spare barrels and positioned them within easy reach. He also stockpiled additional ammunition, carrying extra belts from company supply points during the relative quiet before the offensive began. His instinct told him they would need every round they could accumulate. That instinct would prove correct. The days before the German offensive had a strange quality. Veterans sensed something building: increased German artillery fire, patrol activity, and the general atmospheric tension that preceded major operations. Intelligence reports mentioned German troop movements, but High Command interpreted these as defensive repositioning rather than offensive preparation. Company E's soldiers weren't privy to intelligence assessments. They simply knew something felt wrong. December 16th dawned cold and foggy. Visibility was measured in yards rather than miles. Soldiers on watch peered into grey murk, seeing nothing but trees and snow. Then, around 5:30 in the morning, the world exploded. German artillery hammered American positions in a bombardment that exceeded anything most veterans had experienced. The barrage continued for 90 minutes, transforming defensive positions into moonscapes of shattered trees and cratered earth. The artillery preparation targeted command posts, communication lines, and known defensive positions. German forward observers had been marking targets for weeks, noting exactly where American strongpoints lay. The bombardment was precise and devastating. Company E's command post took a direct hit, killing the executive officer and wounding several staff personnel. Communication wires were severed, radio antennas were damaged. The company found itself partially decapitated at the moment when command and control mattered most. When the artillery lifted, German infantry emerged from the fog. These weren't the demoralized understrength units Americans had faced during their advance into Germany. These were fresh troops from reconstituted divisions, supported by tanks from elite panzer formations. They advanced with practiced tactical discipline, using terrain expertly and suppressing American positions with heavy weapons fire. The initial assault overran forward American outposts. Companies that had been strung too thin along excessive frontages found their positions infiltrated and surrounded. Radio nets filled with desperate calls for support, artillery fire missions, and reports of German penetrations. Within hours of the offensive's start, the coherent American defensive line had fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance. Company E found itself partially encircled by mid-morning. German forces had pushed past both flanks, cutting the road that served as the unit's supply line and escape route. The company commander, Captain Richard Bradford, understood their situation immediately. They couldn't retreat. The Germans controlled the routes behind them. They couldn't expect reinforcement. Division headquarters had its own desperate crisis to manage. Company E would hold their current positions or die trying. Bradford was a West Point graduate who had joined the division in North Africa. He had earned his position through demonstrated competence under fire rather than connections or seniority. His soldiers trusted him because he made sound tactical decisions and didn't waste lives unnecessarily. Now he faced a decision that would determine whether any of them survived the next 72 hours. He chose to defend. Company E would hold their current positions, deny the Germans access to the road junction, and trust that higher command would eventually restore the situation. It was perhaps the only choice available, but recognizing necessity doesn't make executing it any easier. Bradford organized his defenses, positioned his limited reserves, and prepared to fight the battle of his life. Kowalski's machine gun position became critical to the company's survival. His field of fire covered the primary approach route German forces needed to exploit their breakthrough. If his position fell, the Germans could pour troops through the gap and roll up the entire company from the flank. Everything depended on Ethel. The battle that developed around Kowalski's machine gun position over the next 72 hours illuminated fundamental truths about warfare that no amount of peacetime testing could reveal. The first truth: in combat, Mechanical reliability matters less than the operator's understanding of his weapon's limitations. Ethel jammed multiple times during the battle, but never at moments that proved fatal, because Kowalski managed the gun intelligently, never pushing it beyond limits he understood intimately. The second truth, sustained defensive fire, matters more than theoretical rates of fire. Military planners obsessed over whether machine guns could fire 400 rounds per minute or 500 rounds per minute. But Kowalski never needed such rates. He fired disciplined bursts, making every round count. His assistant gunner, Martinez, later estimated they fired approximately 2,000 rounds during the battle's most intense phases, a rate of less than 30 rounds per minute, sustained over an hour. This conservative fire discipline kept Ethel cool enough to function reliably while conserving ammunition that couldn't be resupplied. The third truth, machine guns shaped battlefield geometry in ways that multiplied their actual killing power. Ethel didn't stop the German assault by killing hundreds of enemy soldiers. In fact, Kowalski's crew probably killed fewer than 20 Germans directly, but their machine gun forced entire German units to take cover, to move slowly and cautiously, to bunch up in dead ground where American mortars and artillery could devastate them. The machine gun channeled German movement into predictable patterns that other American weapons exploited ruthlessly. Understanding these truths requires understanding how machine guns actually function in defensive combat. A single rifle can threaten enemies only in a narrow cone of fire. Riflemen must aim deliberately at individual targets. Machine guns, by contrast, create zones of fire where bullets saturate space. Any movement through that zone invites death. This forces attacking troops to avoid the zone entirely or accept horrific casualties crossing it. Kowalski positioned Ethel to create such a zone across the forest trail German forces needed to use. The trail represented the path of least resistance through heavily wooded terrain. German commanders could choose to lead their troops through dense forest, where movement would be slow and formations would become disorganized, or they could use the trail and accept the machine gun's fire. Military logic dictated trying to suppress or destroy the machine gun, rather than avoiding it. Doing so would open the route for rapid advance. The Germans tried suppression first. Mortars rained down around Kowalski's position, trying to kill the crew or damage the weapon. Machine gun fire from German MG-42s raked the position, forcing the Americans to take cover. German snipers fired from concealed positions, searching for any exposed target. This preparatory fire lasted 20 minutes, churning the position into a landscape of shattered wood and torn earth. The MG-42 that German troops employed was, in many technical respects, superior to the M1919A4. It fired at nearly twice the rate, approaching 1,200 rounds per minute in short bursts. The distinctive sound it made, so fast that individual shots blurred into a continuous ripping noise, terrified Allied soldiers who called it Hitler's buzzsaw. The weapon's quick-change barrel system allowed sustained fire that the M1919A4 couldn't match. Yet the MG-42's higher rate of fire was a mixed blessing. It consumed ammunition at prodigious rates, creating supply challenges for German forces already stretched thin by years of war. The weapon's complexity made it more difficult to maintain under field conditions, and its psychological impact, while real, didn't necessarily translate to greater tactical effectiveness. A machine gun that fired slower but was positioned better could achieve more than a faster weapon poorly employed. Then came the assault. German infantry advanced in small teams, using available cover and supporting each other with practiced precision. These were experienced soldiers executing tactics they had rehearsed countless times. They moved fast, closing the distance before defensive fire could become overwhelming. Their training emphasized aggression, speed, and violence of action, characteristics that had served Wehrmacht forces well throughout the war. The German assault tactics reflected hard lessons learned on the Eastern Front, where Soviet defenses had proven formidable and costly to overcome. German infantry had developed sophisticated methods for coordinating small unit movements, using suppressive fire to cover advances, and concentrating force at decisive points. They were arguably the most tactically proficient infantry in Europe, with years of combat experience informing their doctrine. Kowalski waited. Every instinct screamed to open fire immediately, to start killing Germans before they got close. But he understood machine gun mathematics. Firing at maximum effective range meant hitting very few targets, perhaps one or two Germans at most. Waiting until the assault closed to short range meant every burst would find multiple targets. The psychology was nearly unbearable, watching death approach and not responding, but the arithmetic was undeniable. At 75 yards, Kowalski opened fire. His first burst caught 3 Germans crossing a small clearing. They fell instantly, the heavy .30 caliber rounds producing casualties that were immediate and visible. His second burst swept the trail, forcing a German squad to dive for cover behind fallen logs. Martinez fed the belt smoothly, ensuring no snags interrupted the gun's rhythm. Henderson monitored the barrel temperature, ready to change it the instant Kowalski gave the signal. The sound of the M1919A4 firing was distinctive, a hammering mechanical rhythm quite different from the ripping sound of German MG42s. American soldiers found it reassuring, while German troops learned to identify it with concern. The weapon's presence meant organized resistance, competent crews, and potentially supporting weapons coordinated with the machine gun's fire. The German assault faltered. Troops who moments before had been advancing confidently now found themselves pinned down by fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The machine gun's noise, that distinctive hammering sound, created a psychological impact far exceeding its actual destructive power. Soldiers instinctively flinched from that sound, even when bullets weren't directed at them personally. German casualties mounted, not from Ethel alone. American riflemen joined the fight, picking off targets that exposed themselves trying to flank the machine gun position. Mortars fired by Company E's weapons platoon dropped rounds among German troops caught in the open. Artillery fire called down by forward observers pulverized Germans trapped in the beaten zone without adequate cover. The machine gun orchestrated this symphony of destruction, conducting other weapons toward targets it revealed. Private Henderson spotted movement to their left, Germans attempting to work through the forest and attack the machine gun position from the flank. He engaged them with his M1 carbine, the lighter weapon suited for close-range fighting in wooded terrain. Henderson killed 2 Germans and drove others back, buying time for Kowalski to reposition Ethel to cover the new threat. This flexibility proved crucial. The M1919A4's relative lightness, compared to water-cooled alternatives, allowed the crew to shift the weapon's position quickly when tactical situations demanded. A heavier weapon might have kept the crew fixed in place, unable to respond to flanking threats. Ethel's mobility gave them options that saved their lives. The German assault broke. Survivors retreated, dragging wounded comrades and abandoning equipment. The forest trail, which minutes earlier had seemed like a promising avenue of advance, was now a killing ground where bodies lay motionless in the snow. German commanders would need a different approach. They tried repeatedly over the next hours, probing for weaknesses in Company E's defenses. Each probe encountered resistance, particularly from Kowalski's position, which commanded such crucial terrain. The Germans began to recognize that this single machine gun position represented the key to breaking through Company E's sector. Destroy that position, and the entire defensive line might collapse. By nightfall on the first day, German forces had achieved tactical reconnaissance. They understood where American positions lay, where the strongest defenses clustered, and where vulnerabilities existed. They had paid for this knowledge with casualties, dozens of men killed or wounded against Company E alone, multiplied across the entire offensive front into thousands of losses. But they had gained the information needed to plan more effective assaults. The night brought a different kind of terror. German forces used darkness to infiltrate close to American positions, cutting communication wires, laying mines on potential reinforcement routes, and positioning assault teams for dawn attacks. American defenders heard movement in the darkness, shapes barely visible in the snow-reflected starlight, sounds that might be wind or might be enemy soldiers preparing to attack. Kowalski's crew took turns on watch, 2 men always alert while the third tried to sleep. Sleep came in fitful installments, interrupted by the sound of distant fighting, nearby patrols, or simply the adrenaline that made rest impossible. They ate cold rations. Heating food would reveal their position, and drank water from canteens kept inside their coats to prevent freezing. Martinez whispered stories to pass the long hours, tales from his childhood in New Mexico, memories of hot summers that seemed impossibly distant from this frozen Belgian forest. The stories served a purpose beyond entertainment. They reminded them of who they were beyond their current roles as soldiers. They had lives before the war and would have lives after if they survived. Henderson wrote another letter home by the faint light of a shielded flashlight. He described the Belgian countryside, the architecture of local villages, the kindness of civilians who shared what little food they possessed. He never mentioned that he was currently surrounded, low on ammunition, and expecting to die when dawn brought renewed German assaults. His parents would receive this cheerful letter weeks later, long after they received the telegram informing them of his death. The standoff that developed over the next 2 days illustrated something profound about defensive warfare. A well-positioned machine gun operated by a competent crew could exert influence wildly disproportionate to its technical capabilities. German forces had overwhelming numerical superiority in Company E's sector. They possessed more troops, more supporting weapons, and arguably superior tactical training. Yet they could not advance past a single machine gun position. This combat effectiveness emerged from the intersection of multiple factors. Kowalski's crew brought exceptional competence, maintaining their weapon flawlessly despite horrible conditions. The terrain favored defense, channeling attackers into predictable approaches. American artillery provided devastating support at critical moments. And Ethel herself, despite her reputation for unreliability, performed when it mattered most. But here's the crucial insight that military historians would debate for decades afterward. Ethel's supposed flaws actually contributed to her battlefield effectiveness. The gun's sensitivity to overheating forced Kowalski to fire conservatively, which conserved ammunition and prevented the barrel burnout that might have disabled the weapon permanently. The mechanical simplicity that caused reliability problems during testing made field repairs possible when stoppages did occur. Martinez could field strip and clear Ethel in under a minute, even in darkness, even under fire. More complex weapons might have been more reliable in pristine conditions, but irreparable when damaged in combat. This paradox reveals a fundamental disconnect between how military organizations evaluate weapons and how those weapons actually perform in warfare. Testing protocols emphasized performance under ideal conditions, clean weapons, fresh ammunition, controlled environments. But combat was the opposite of ideal conditions. Combat meant dirt, moisture, extreme temperatures, stressed operators, and degraded maintenance. Weapons that excelled in testing sometimes failed catastrophically in actual fighting. Weapons with mediocre test results sometimes proved devastatingly effective. The American military's approach to weapons testing had evolved considerably by World War II. Ardennes Proving Ground represented a sophisticated effort to evaluate firearms under realistic conditions. Engineers subjected weapons to dust, sand, moisture, and temperature extremes. They measured accuracy, rate of fire, and parts breakage over extended firing cycles. They evaluated ease of maintenance and parts interchangeability. The testing was thorough and scientifically rigorous, yet it still failed to predict combat performance accurately. The problem was that testing could simulate individual stresses, but couldn't replicate their combination with human factors under life-threatening stress. A weapon might pass dust testing and cold weather testing separately, but fail when exposed to both simultaneously while operated by a frightened soldier under enemy fire. Combat created emergent complexity that defeated reductionist testing methodologies. The M1919A4 belonged firmly in the category of weapons that tested poorly but fought well. It was never the most reliable machine gun of World War II. German MG42s had higher rates of fire. Soviet machine guns were more resistant to environmental extremes, but the M1919A4 possessed virtues that testing couldn't measure: simplicity that allowed field repairs, ergonomics that facilitated accurate fire, and weight that permitted tactical flexibility. These virtues mattered more in actual combat than the flaws that testing had revealed. Kowalski's defense of his position also demonstrated tactical principles that military doctrine sometimes obscured. Official manuals emphasized killing enemy troops as the primary purpose of defensive fire. But Kowalski's greatest contribution wasn't the Germans he killed, it was the Germans he fixed in place for other weapons to destroy. His machine gun shaped the battlefield geometry, creating conditions where American artillery, mortars and rifles could achieve maximum effectiveness. This broader understanding of machine gun employment would influence American tactical doctrine for generations. The weapon's purpose wasn't simply to shoot enemies, its purpose was to control space, to deny ground to enemy forces, to channel their movement into patterns that favored defenders. A machine gun that never fired a shot, but forced attackers to take longer, more dangerous routes, was still earning its keep on the battlefield. Infantry tactics textbooks written after the war would emphasize this principle. Machine guns were termed base of fire weapons, around which maneuver elements operated. The machine gun fixed the enemy in place. Other elements maneuvered to destroy them. This doctrinal understanding reflected lessons learned in battles like the Ardennes, where outnumbered defenders used machine guns to multiply their combat effectiveness beyond what sheer firepower alone could achieve. The third day of fighting brought German desperation. Their offensive was behind schedule, with lead elements still far short of objectives they should have reached days earlier. High command demanded breakthrough and exploitation. Local commanders needed to open routes through American defensive positions. Company E represented an obstacle that couldn't be bypassed or ignored. The German assault came at dawn with unprecedented intensity. Artillery preparation targeted American positions with precision, suggesting careful observation and planning. Smoke rounds obscured the battlefield, denying Americans clear fields of fire. German armor, rare this far forward, supported the infantry assault, their cannon fire suppressing American strongpoints. Kowalski heard the tanks before seeing them. The distinctive diesel engine sound of German Panthers carried clearly through morning air. Tanks changed everything. Ethel's .30 caliber ammunition couldn't penetrate tank armor except at point-blank range against thin side plates. The machine gun that had dominated the battlefield for 2 days suddenly seemed inadequate against mechanized assault. The Panther tank represented Germany's answer to Soviet T-34s and heavy KV series tanks that had shocked Wehrmacht forces on the Eastern Front. With thick, sloped armor and a powerful 75mm cannon, Panthers were formidable weapons that American tank destroyers struggled to defeat. Infantry facing Panthers with only small arms and light anti-tank weapons felt justifiably terrified. But tanks, powerful as they were, remained vulnerable without infantry support. American defenders targeted the German infantry, advancing with the armor, forcing them to take cover and opening gaps between tanks and their supporting troops. Isolated tanks became vulnerable to bazookas and satchel charges. One Panther threw a track trying to navigate shell-cratered ground, immobilizing it. Another withdrew after bazooka rounds damaged its optics and vision ports. Kowalski kept Ethel firing, engaging infantry targets and forcing German troops to remain buttoned up inside their vehicles, where situational awareness was minimal. The machine gun couldn't kill tanks, but it could degrade the combined arms coordination that made German armor effective. Without infantry support, the tanks became cautious, reluctant to push too aggressively into positions where close-range anti-tank weapons might be waiting. The doctrine of combined arms warfare, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and supporting elements into integrated tactical systems, represented one of the most important military innovations of World War II. Neither tanks nor infantry alone could achieve what they accomplished together. Tanks provided mobile firepower and protection, but were vulnerable to infantry anti-tank weapons. Infantry could hold ground and exploit covered terrain, but lacked firepower and mobility. Together, they were nearly unstoppable. Separating these elements, therefore, became a key defensive tactic. American forces in the Ardennes couldn't defeat German combined arms assaults directly. They lacked the resources and firepower, but they could disrupt the coordination, forcing tanks to operate without infantry support or pinning infantry down, while tanks advanced alone. These separated elements were individually vulnerable to American anti-tank weapons and artillery. The assault peaked around mid-morning, then began losing momentum. German casualties accumulated faster than tactical gains. American defensive positions, while battered, remained intact. The critical road junction remained in American hands. German commanders faced a brutal choice: continue the assault and accept horrific losses for minimal gains, or break off and seek another route. They chose to break off. The German offensive would continue elsewhere, would achieve some local successes, would create the bulge in Allied lines that gave the battle its name. But in Company E's sector, the assault had failed decisively. One battalion of German infantry, supported by armor and artillery, had been stopped by a vastly smaller American force. The failure had strategic implications beyond the immediate tactical situation. The German offensive's entire operational plan depended on rapid advance to capture critical objectives before American reinforcements arrived. Delays of even hours could prove fatal to the plan's success. Company E's defense, and specifically Kowalski's machine gun position, had created precisely such delays in their sector. Kowalski's crew fired their last burst around noon on the third day. German forces pulled back, abandoning efforts to force this particular route. The forest trail that had been a killing ground fell silent. Bodies lay frozen in the snow, American and German both, testaments to the savage fighting that had raged there. Ethel was filthy, caked with powder residue, the barrel worn from firing several thousand rounds, but she was still functional. Martinez field-stripped the weapon, cleaned each component, and reassembled it, while Kowalski and Henderson stood guard. The mechanical process was soothing after days of combat stress, the familiar routine providing psychological comfort. They had survived. Against odds that seemed overwhelming, they had held their position and denied the Germans their objectives. The realization brought not triumph, but profound exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained them through 3 days of combat ebbed away, leaving only fatigue and the numb recognition of how close they had come to death. Captain Bradford visited the position later that afternoon. He brought ammunition, rations, and a bottle of cognac, liberated from a Belgian cellar. He said little, there was little to say, but his presence acknowledged what they had accomplished. Bradford understood that Kowalski's crew had saved the company, perhaps saved the entire battalion. The machine gun position had been the hinge on which Company E's defense turned. The battle that Company E fought, and specifically the role that Kowalski's machine gun position played, raises uncomfortable questions about how military organizations prepare for war. The M1919A4 had been declared problematic based on testing that failed to predict actual combat performance. How many other weapons suffered similar misjudgment? How many potentially superior designs were rejected because they didn't excel in artificial testing environments? These questions matter because weapons procurement represents massive investments of national resources. Getting it wrong means soldiers die unnecessarily or fight with inferior equipment. The M1919A4 succeeded in the Ardennes despite its testing failures, but this outcome was partly fortunate. If Kowalski's crew had been less competent, or if battlefield conditions had differed slightly, Ethel might have failed catastrophically and validated every negative testing report. The deeper issue is whether realistic testing is even possible. Combat creates conditions that cannot be fully replicated in peacetime. The stress of being shot at, the fear of dying, the physical exhaustion of sustained operations, these factors affect both human performance and mechanical reliability in ways that test protocols cannot capture. Soldiers maintain weapons differently in garrison than in combat. They operate them differently when death is the consequence of failure. Perhaps the solution isn't better testing, but rather designing weapons that tolerate abuse and maintain functionality under degraded conditions. The M1919A4 achieved this somewhat accidentally. Its mechanical simplicity meant that most failures could be cleared quickly. Its parts were interchangeable, allowing cannibalization and field repairs. These characteristics weren't design priorities. They were side effects of engineering constraints and manufacturing considerations, but they proved crucial to combat effectiveness. Modern military organizations continue struggling with these issues. Advanced weapons systems become increasingly complex, incorporating electronics, sensors, and computerized fire control. These systems perform brilliantly under ideal conditions, but sometimes fail when exposed to the chaos and degradation of actual combat. The fundamental tension between reliability and capability persists. The moral dimensions of the Ardennes battle also deserve examination. Kowalski killed perhaps 20 German soldiers directly. His machine gun contributed to the deaths of dozens more killed by artillery and mortars that Ethel channeled into kill zones. These Germans were human beings, sons, husbands, fathers, fighting for a monstrous regime, but not necessarily monsters themselves. Did they deserve to die? This question haunted combat veterans for the rest of their lives. Kowalski struggled with it, according to family members who spoke about his war experience years later. He had killed men who were trying to kill him, who served a government responsible for unprecedented evil, who would have gladly killed American soldiers given the opportunity. Self-defense and just cause both justified his actions. Yet the act of killing still scarred him psychologically in ways that never fully healed. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't well understood in the 1940s. Soldiers suffering psychological trauma were diagnosed with combat fatigue or shell shock, terms that implied temporary conditions that would resolve with rest. The reality was more complex. Many veterans carried psychological wounds for decades, experiencing nightmares, survivor's guilt, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness that affected their relationships and quality of life. Kowalski's nightmares focused on specific moments from the Ardennes battle. He would wake convinced that Germans were assaulting his position, that Ethel had jammed, that Martinez and Henderson were dying. His wife learned to wake him gently, to speak calmly until the nightmare released its grip. These episodes never stopped entirely, though they became less frequent over the years. The German soldiers killed in those frozen Belgian forests were products of a military system that had committed terrible crimes. Wehrmacht forces participated in atrocities on the Eastern Front, supported Nazi occupation policies, and implemented orders that violated basic human rights. Arguing that German soldiers in the Ardennes were somehow innocent victims of circumstance ignores uncomfortable historical reality. Yet they were also victims of their own government, conscripted into a war they might not have chosen, fighting for a regime many privately opposed. The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's gamble, not something ordinary German soldiers demanded. Many Wehrmacht troops by late 1944 understood that Germany had lost the war and that continuing to fight only delayed inevitable defeat while accumulating casualties. This moral complexity defines war generally. Combat rarely offers clear ethical choices. It instead forces decisions between bad options and worse options, with consequences measured in lives destroyed. Kowalski chose to defend his position because allowing German forces to break through would cost American lives, possibly including his own. That calculation made sense militarily and morally, but it still required him to kill human beings, an act that carried psychological costs regardless of justification. The philosophical question of whether there can be justice in warfare has occupied thinkers since ancient times. Just war theory, developed by theologians and philosophers, attempts to establish criteria for when warfare is morally permissible and how it should be conducted. By these standards, Allied participation in World War II generally meets criteria for just cause. Stopping Nazi aggression and genocide represented legitimate moral justification, but just cause at the strategic level doesn't necessarily answer moral questions at the tactical level. Individual soldiers killing other individual soldiers each face their own moral reckoning. Kowalski wasn't fighting to stop the Holocaust or defend democracy in the abstract. He was fighting to survive and protect his fellow soldiers. These immediate concrete motivations mattered more than grand strategic justifications. The M1919A4's role in this battle also illuminates how technology shapes warfare in unexpected ways. Military historians often analyze new weapons as discrete innovations. Tanks brought mobility to warfare. Aircraft enabled three-dimensional battlefields. Nuclear weapons made total war suicidal. But individual weapons like machine guns influenced tactics and operational art in subtler ways. Machine guns forced fundamental changes in how infantry attacked defended positions. The massed frontal assaults that characterized 19th century warfare became suicidal against machine gun fire. Armies developed infiltration tactics, combined arms operations, and suppressive fire techniques specifically to overcome machine gun defenses. The weapons themselves weren't revolutionary. They just made bullets travel faster than riflemen could achieve. But that incremental change had cascading effects across entire military systems. The M1919A4 represented evolutionary refinement of machine gun technology, not revolutionary innovation. It was lighter than earlier designs, more portable, more tactically flexible. These incremental improvements enabled American infantry doctrine that emphasized flexibility and adaptation. The Germans built doctrine around machine guns. Americans built doctrine that used machine guns as one tool among many. Neither approach was inherently superior. Effectiveness depended on circumstances, resources, and implementation. Comparing the Ardennes fighting to other battles reveals patterns in how machine guns influenced outcomes. At the Somme in World War I, German machine guns inflicted catastrophic casualties on attacking British infantry. At Guadalcanal, American machine guns broke Japanese banzai charges. At Stalingrad, Soviet machine guns created killing zones in urban rubble. The weapon's tactical effect remained remarkably consistent across different armies, terrain, and operational contexts. Michael Kowalski survived the Battle of the Bulge. He returned home to Chicago after VE Day, reunited with his wife Ethel, and resumed working at the meatpacking plant. He rarely spoke about the war, a silence common among combat veterans who found that civilians couldn't understand what they had experienced. The machine gun that bore his wife's name disappeared into military supply systems, probably eventually scrapped or sold as surplus. Kowalski lived until 1987, dying of heart failure at age 65. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioned his service in the 1st Infantry Division, but provided no details about specific battles. The machine gun position he defended in Belgium went unmentioned. Most of his colleagues at the meatpacking plant never knew he was a combat veteran, much less that he had held off a German battalion during one of the war's most critical battles. He attended 1st Infantry Division reunions sporadically, uncomfortable with the nostalgia and bonhomie that characterized these gatherings. War hadn't been glorious or noble in his experience. It had been terrifying, exhausting, and morally complicated. The reunions emphasized camaraderie and shared sacrifice while glossing over the trauma and cost. Kowalski appreciated seeing old comrades, but always left early, unwilling to participate in sanitized recollections that bore little resemblance to his memories. James Martinez returned to New Mexico and took over his family's ranch. He married, raised 3 children, and lived into his 80s. In later years, he sometimes spoke about the war to his grandchildren, describing the cold, the fear, and the strange bonds between men who depended on each other for survival. He kept a photograph of Kowalski and Henderson, fellow crew members he never saw again after the war, but never forgot. Martinez proved more willing than Kowalski to discuss combat experiences, though he too struggled with how to convey the reality of warfare to people who hadn't experienced it. His grandchildren heard stories that were simultaneously horrifying and somehow abstract, descriptions of battles that sounded like scenes from movies rather than events that had actually happened to their grandfather. He died in 2003, one of the last surviving members of Company E's Ardennes defense. His funeral drew attention from local historians documenting New Mexican veterans' experiences in World War II. They interviewed him extensively in his final years, preserving oral history testimony that provided invaluable perspective on how ordinary soldiers experienced extraordinary events. Robert Henderson was killed in action in Germany 3 months after the Ardennes battle. He died during the crossing of the Rhine River, struck by mortar fire while his unit advanced toward the German heartland. He was 19 years old. His body was eventually returned to Iowa and buried in a small cemetery outside his hometown. His name appears on a memorial plaque in the county courthouse. Henderson's death devastated his parents. He was their only child, raised on the family farm with expectations that he would eventually take it over and continue the agricultural tradition that had sustained the family for generations. His death meant the end of that continuity. His father continued farming until age, and declining health forced him to sell. Without Henderson to inherit the land, there seemed little point in maintaining it. The letters Henderson wrote from Belgium arrived weeks after his death. His parents read these cheerful accounts of foreign travel while processing their grief. The disconnect between Henderson's optimistic tone and the telegram announcing his death created cognitive dissonance that haunted them. Had he known he was going to die? Had the cheerfulness been performance for their benefit? They would never know. The 1st Infantry Division continued fighting through Germany until the Nazi surrender in May 1945. The division compiled one of the most distinguished combat records in the European theater, participating in every major American campaign from North Africa through central Germany. The machine gun crews of Company E were part of that legacy, anonymous soldiers whose individual actions shaped operational outcomes. Division casualties throughout the war exceeded 200%, meaning the division suffered more casualties than its authorized strength. This grim arithmetic reflected the reality of sustained combat. Units remained intact through continuous replacement of killed and wounded soldiers. The 1st Infantry Division that accepted Germany's surrender bore the same name and carried the same traditions as the division that landed in North Africa, but consisted almost entirely of different individuals. The M1919A4 Browning machine gun served through World War II, Korea, and Vietnam before finally being retired from American military service. Total production exceeded hundreds of thousands of weapons. The design influenced machine gun development worldwide, with numerous countries producing licensed or derivative versions. John Moses Browning's basic operating principles remained sound for decades after his death. The weapon's longevity testified to its fundamental soundness. Despite testing problems and reliability concerns, the M1919A4 proved adaptable enough to serve effectively across multiple conflicts in vastly different operational environments. From the frozen forests of Belgium to the jungles of Vietnam, the gun performed when competent crews maintained and employed it properly. Yet the weapon's legacy extends beyond mere longevity. The M1919A4 demonstrated that effective weapons need not be perfect weapons. Reliability matters, but so does maintainability, adaptability, and match with tactical doctrine. The gun that military testers deemed problematic proved devastatingly effective in actual combat because it aligned with how American forces actually fought. This lesson remains relevant in contemporary defense planning. Modern military organizations invest billions in weapons development, often prioritizing technical perfection over battlefield effectiveness. Testing protocols grow increasingly elaborate, attempting to simulate combat conditions with ever greater fidelity. Yet the fundamental problem persists. Actual warfare defies simulation. Combat generates emergent complexities that no test protocol can fully anticipate. The solution isn't abandoning testing or accepting inferior equipment. Rather, it's understanding that testing reveals only partial truth. Weapons must be evaluated in context, not just technical context of specifications and performance metrics, but tactical context of how they'll actually be employed by real soldiers in chaotic conditions. The M1919A4 succeeded because soldiers like Kowalski, Martinez, and Henderson adapted their tactics to the weapon's characteristics. They worked around its flaws and exploited its strengths. This human element proves impossible to test in advance. Military organizations can train soldiers, can develop doctrine, can conduct realistic exercises, but they cannot predict how specific individuals will perform in actual combat. Some soldiers excel under stress, others freeze. Some crews develop intuitive coordination, others never achieve effective teamwork. These human factors often matter more than technical weapon characteristics. The frozen ridge where Kowalski's crew made their stand has returned to peaceful forest. Nothing marks the spot where dozens of men died. Belgium's Ardennes is beautiful country, with rolling hills, dense woodlands, and picturesque villages. Tourists visit, drawn by the region's history and natural beauty. Few realize they're walking battlefields where desperate fighting once raged. Several monuments commemorate the Battle of the Bulge throughout the Ardennes region. The Mardisson Memorial near Bastogne honors American soldiers who fought there. Museums in various towns preserve artifacts and testimony from the battle. Tour companies lead groups through significant sites, explaining tactical situations and strategic importance. But the battle's legacy persists in unexpected ways. Veterans who survived carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Families mourned sons and husbands who never returned. Communities throughout America felt the war's impact through the men they lost. The Ardennes wasn't just a battle, it was a wound inflicted on an entire generation. So when we ask what makes a weapon legendary, the answer proves complex. It's not flawless engineering, because the M1919A4 was demonstrably flawed. It's not universal acclaim, because the weapon had critics throughout its service life. It's not even superior performance, because other machine guns exceeded the M1919A4's capabilities by various metrics. Instead, legendary status comes from proven effectiveness in decisive moments. The M1919A4 earned its place in history not by being perfect, but by being there when it mattered, in the hands of soldiers who knew how to use it, fighting battles that shaped history's course. That's what made it legendary. The gun jammed in tests. It failed evaluations. Military brass questioned whether it deserved a place in America's arsenal. Then war came, and the weapon that shouldn't have worked became the weapon that couldn't be beaten. That paradox defines not just the M1919A4, but warfare itself, where the unexpected becomes normal, where flawed tools in skilled hands outperform perfect tools poorly used, and where courage and competence matter more than specifications and test results ever could.